Welcome to the Bikeshed Podcast, where we talk about all things software engineering, ISO versus Unix timestamps, and who's better at Call of Duty. I'm your co-host, UI Stan, coffee connoisseur, and venerated NeoVim user, Scott Kaye. And joining me are my esteemed co-hosts, a man who arises before the sun, who sits at his standing desk, the Git commit message perfectionist, Matt Hamlin. And to my other side, the man who always knows how to season a good time, Dillon Spicy Take Curry. Matt, what's on our agenda today?
Another great intro, Scott. Thank you. Today, we're talking a little bit about testing. I think it's a broad, sweeping topic, so we might bounce around to different thoughts about testing and specifically the automated testing, I guess. Although we could talk about manual testing too. I figured I think it's an interesting topic to discuss, and maybe we'll find places that we actually want to split off into separate episodes. But I figured we want to just kind of talk about what's our preferred style of writing tests. Do we prefer unit tests over integration tests? Do we prefer end-to-end tests? What's our preferred suite of tools that we reach for when writing tests? Whether you like mocking or not. How does your company approach testing? How do you personally approach testing? I think there's a lot to dig into there. I guess to get started, Dillon, curious your take on, maybe I don't know if there's a correct take on, preferred unit versus integration versus end-to-end. But curious, where you've found maybe the most value in spending your time when writing tests. And maybe we start from there.
The most value. I feel like I find the most value after writing tests. During writing tests, I don't feel like I'm finding a lot of value. It's like the next day, the next week, the next month when I'm writing more code, and it protects me from making mistakes. While I'm writing them, I don't feel happy about it usually. I can feel pretty good when I'm done that okay, I'm pretty confident this is well tested. But what I've definitely found the most value, in the future, when the tests have saved me. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good, good perspective of maybe most engineers don't enjoy writing tests. I think there's people that do and maybe enjoy it, but in terms of convincing your manager or your company that you're doing good work, it's writing the test suite isn't necessarily delivering value, but over time it delivers incremental value, maybe is the way to look at it, right? Prevent a suite of bugs based on this test suite.
It's sort of like an insurance plan in a sense. It just gives you some extra guardrails in the future to prevent your company from failing over.
Curious. So I guess to dive into specifics, have you found that is there a specific style of testing? I guess or unit versus integration, or bigger tests versus smaller tests. Is there a specific style that you found to be more beneficial over time, or?
I think when we say unit testing and we're in the front end space, it can get a bit I don't know, overused when we're not actually always unit testing. Because in front end testing, if you've used it jest, you as soon as you use jest and you start rendering React components, now you have a virtual DOM in memory that you're testing against, which is sort of pseudo mock integration test at that point, right? It's no longer a pure unit test. To me, unit testing is you have a basic function and you just pass in inputs and expect outputs. And I found that if I can do that sort of thing, have the least amount of dependencies and do a pure unit test, I definitely enjoy testing a lot more. Even though I do appreciate all the new things that come out of things like React Testing Library, where I can simulate events and things like that. It does get a little bit more difficult the more and more I don't know, interactive, and the more and more you try to simulate things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, like reducing the number of variables at play. Definitely, I feel like.
Yeah, there's like a lot of things going off in my head around just like the more you mock, the more testing feels useless, at least in my mind.
Yeah, that's a good call. Like, I guess I'm also curious. Like, I think mocking has like maybe different definitions depending on who you talk to. I think that like in something like Jest or similar testing tools like mocking, you could like sort of completely mock an internal dependency of the code that you're trying to test without necessarily like knowing about it in a sense, like literally using like just.mock or like mock function and whatnot, like those helpers. But then there's also like in my mind there's a similar sort of strategy around mocking of like dependency injection is kind of a form of mocking. Like you're passing in a mocked implementation of something into your function you're testing. But I feel like in the ecosystem, or at least from the engineers that I've worked with in the past, it's like dependency injection is like maybe seen in good light, whereas mocking is seen in a bad light, which is interesting to me.
Yeah, that's strange. They're basically the same thing. You're right. But I think dependency injection is just always seen as like a rule of programming that you should follow or something. Like it's in the same realm as like single responsibility principle and things like that. Yeah. I would say that like I don't I think your original question was like where do you spend the most of your time testing? Sort of. You sort of asked that. Um and I think I do spend the most time with unit tests. I think I prefer end-to-end tests. Like the style of writing those tests is a lot more like rewarding because I can like see it happening in the front end space. But I do think those tests are typically just so much more flaky that I've seen that on teams that I've worked on that like over time you slowly just like delete them because they no longer become useful to you because your backend APIs just changed so much that those end-to-end tests no longer function the way that you expect. I know there's like maybe a lot loaded in there, so maybe some of you guys have some thoughts on that.
One example where I've seen like end-to-end tests or like more integration-y tests work successfully is where when you have like sort of a scoped assertion or a scope set of assertions. Something we've done pretty well in the code base that I work in most at work right now is we have about 100 or so fixture tests, which are basically running a CLI, which under the hood runs like Webpack or like can run Webpack to do like a build or do like a dev serve sort of workflow. Um, and we basically only assert on the sort of the content that we add to the assertion test, which is I don't know if that makes that much sense, but like if we're asserting on log output, we don't have to worry about checking all the build output as part of that test. Also, we just care about what was set to standard out or standard error, and so it's like very more like very it's refined to a specific like set of things that we care about in that test instead of sort of trying to capture the whole state of the system at that point in time for every test, which I think has made it a little bit easier for us to manage.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a lot more isolated
Yeah,
because of the way that you've set things up.
yeah, I think isolated is a good way to um, name it. Yeah. Scott, curious, like some of your sort of takes, whether it's mocking or NN versus unit testing, and yeah.
Well, I'm going to start with the first question you posed to Dylan. Like, where do I spend my most time um, testing? And funny enough, like, so I've gone like in circles around this because I've had jobs of being at a big tech company, and now I've been at small places, but I spend the most time manually debugging my code when I'm writing it. Cop out answer, but lately when I write something, I'm manually just making sure it does what I need it to do. I don't think that that's necessarily the best answer, but that's what I'm doing most often. I'm not really doing too much TDD, but I do have a few like thoughts. I think unit tests in my experience, have been good to kind of determine what patterns may have been overlooked in small code or at a large scale organization, or like what is supported. I'm thinking about some of our time on the design system where we would check for certain props and whatnot. And from there, you can kind of understand like what did you expect something to do. So I think there's some merit to unit tests there. But I've grown to think that integration testing is better for features that are most important to catch that something is going wrong or something is awry. I also believe tests that don't slow us down are more valuable than tests often that take a long time, or we need to break down what we're testing. So if you spend weeks on tests, I know there are cases where you spend a while on tests, and it is important. However, it's better to find ways to write smaller tests. And something that we found very successful, Matt and I, is smoke tests. Like, does it throw a 400 or 500 error? It's quick to write, and we can easily determine that something went wrong on what we're working on.
Yeah, I think like something you started to key into there, Scott, is like sort of time and effort spent on tests. I think there's like there's kind of an interesting. I think well, first off, I guess like I think most software engineers probably see it as like if you get to, let's say, something like 80% test coverage, the remaining 20% is probably going to take a lot more than your first 80%. I mean, like that's probably generally true of anything. But I think it's also like there's like the time it takes to build the test suite, but then also the time it takes to run the test suite, and like over time that obviously that investment time to build it is like okay, like a initial cost, but then the time it takes to run it is also an interesting aspect. Like if you end up having so many tests, or like that you have really slow tests, you're actually probably going to find out that you're maybe slowed down more often than you're like sort of I think generally we look at tests as like a way to make sure that we're moving faster because we can release changes without worrying about the bugs that it introduce potentially. But if your test suite is really slow, then it's like going to end up also slowing down your development cycle potentially. Of like you just have to wait. If you push it to CI, you have to wait an hour for your test to pass. That's going to be pretty miserable, I think. And so it's like certainly like it's a trade-off from that lens as well in terms of like investment in unit versus integration versus end-to-end or whatnot. Of like sometimes the integration end-to-end tests take far longer than what a unit test probably could have taken that covers potentially an equivalent flow.
Yeah, I think that goes back to, and I didn't get totally into the time thought, but my opinion now is more of what is essential in the product that we need the user to be able to do. Individual teams. So if we look at this as an e-commerce site, seeing that's our background, a user needs to be able to add a product to a cart and check out, and that's the most important essential thing. There are other probably important cases along the way, but there's only so much in there. There might be nuance to types of products and whatnot that you can add to your cart and whatnot. But if I was an e-commerce site now, I would focus my end-to-end tests on that kind of thing. And less so I go to the homepage, I clicked on X and this showed up. It would probably be the path is I search, the path is I click through some pages. And I would probably like try to document these are the things that are most important. And when bugs come up and arise, then we may have sevs for, we determine whether or not is this a use case for a testing case. Now that's very simple and nuanced, but this is kind of the approach I've been taking at smaller companies. The product we work on, it's can you log in and can you see the page? Can you see every page that exists? Also, I mean, technology plays a big role into this, right? I know for years we used Cypress, and playwright tests are faster and a little bit better, and things are being written in different programming languages to be faster. I think all of that is good, but also, just being mindful of like, do we need this test? Not I'm adding a test for the sake of adding tests. There have been initiatives that we've been a part of that are everything needs a test. And while it's great to think that way and have a test for everything, Matt brought up that 80-20 rule that sometimes 20% of the tests take 80% of the time. And that's not a reason not to do a test that might be very difficult, that has a lot of value, but we need to weigh pros and cons of value and time. We don't want to just build things for the sake of building things. And kind of Dillon hit on this point early, but often we write a ton of tests and over time things just change and they become almost like spaghetti and you find yourself just deleting it or commenting it out and the value isn't there. So trying to predict the value ahead of time is not easy, but just make sure and assure yourself that you understand the value of the test you're building ahead of time.
I want to add that I think we're talking a lot about like the value of end-to-end tests. I think Scott was kind of touching on that. And maybe end-to-end is a bit overused also because we use it for like Playwright and Cypress, which I would say is probably not pure end-to-end. It's like almost fully end-to-end, but it doesn't really test what it's going to be like in production. And I've used synthetic like Datadog tests in the last 6 months. Although I was told like don't make too many of these, they're very expensive. But I prefer those because they just sort of run asynchronously. I can throw them against QA and prod, and I can do a bunch of like user flows, like you're saying, like test the login, test the entire like user flow. What do we expect them to do? In an actual like website that's running. So there's nothing mocked out. Like I'm not mocking out any piece of it. And I found that to be the most valuable thing, to me at least. So I'm just curious if you guys have used tools like that.
I haven't really. I think we maybe tried to test a little bit of that, like that feature of Datadog at Wayfair when we were there, but I don't know if I got like too close to the implementation there to understand or like sort of view the trade-offs of it. I think it gets interesting when you have like a sufficiently complex user experience to use those kinds of tests, right? Like it's like as soon as you start introducing A/B testing, then your tests start to fork. It's like, okay, like if if path A is that the customer goes from page 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, but then path B is 1 to 2 to 5 to 6 to 7 or whatever. It's like it's like how, like your test that you was covering path A now needs to like also know of that the B branch of the A/B test, and account for that being a successful test run and whatnot. So it's like I think but that's like that would occur in almost any kind of test that you run, right? Like if you're doing a mocked or sort of mostly end-to-end or integration test using something like Playwright, like you're gonna run into a similar situation unless you sort of mock the A/B test sort of branch or whatever. Always pin to a specific branch.
Yeah, some things we've done in the past is like passing custom headers or cookies or query params to the synthetic test to sort of pin ourselves to things. But also there's other ways with Datadog synthetics. I'm just like selling the product right now, where you can do like basically optional steps, where if the UI like shows something, it will go down that branch or that path. But if it's not there, it will like ignore it and move on. That's something we've done in a test recently that I felt was like pretty useful. The example there was like we do address validation and hit a service, and if there's like a suggested email based on what they gave, it'll show that in the UI. But if there's not, it won't. So like it changes the flow in that sense, and so the step is optional. Yeah, it's kind of cool.
I know that some folks at W were using that or something similar to that within Datadog. I never used it either, but like we did use monitors as like test adjacent, where when we saw things going wrong, it would give us opportunities to write tests to make sure we corrected it. Yeah, so I get monitors are not tests, but they do help us understand maybe what we're missing or how we can better test test or serve the application, where application might be being used in a way we didn't anticipate. So some of our best tests probably came from monitoring.
Yeah, I think this sort of leads us into an interesting topic in itself of like whether to test in production or like testing in production like in general. I think that's like I had shared this sort of like conceptual model internally to refer to a few people, where it was like sort of like the midwit meme, for those that know it, which is like kind of just basically the bell curve distribution of like, some people on the, sort of the leading edge of the bell curve, some people in the middle of the bell curve, and then some people at the end of the bell curve. And the midwit meme is classically, it's like the thing in the middle is like very popular, but the thing on the start and the end is like less popular. Maybe on the left side is like seen as like, people that don't value or don't like put effort into things, or I don't know, something like that. But then it's like sort of usually the people on the right are doing the same exact thing as the people on the left in terms of like, I've seen this with like note-taking apps. Like Apple Notes is like on the left and on the right, and in the middle is like a huge complex system of Obsidian to Readwise to Apple Notes to Notion, etc. But anyway, so the concept that I had shared internally at Wayfair was like, you have companies that test in production because they're small and they don't have the time and effort to implement a testing strategy, or implement an environment in which they can run tests against that looks kind of similar to prod but doesn't touch production data. And then you have people on the right that are basically doing the same thing, but they have the time and effort to do that, but they just found that testing in production is just easier and better. And then people in the middle where it's like you invest a lot of time and effort to try to build a custom testing environment, and you realize that you're basically replicating production, but then it like keeps getting out of sync every day and whatnot. And so I don't know. I think there's an interesting sort of decision around like how do you approach testing, whether you try to set up an environment that's very similar to production to like what your customers or your users will face, or you just like sort of accept reality and like test where your users are testing your application for you. I don't know. I think that's an interesting topic. Maybe we dig into it now. Maybe we say it's not worth talking about. But yeah.
One thing I'll note is that we're only talking about like automating tests, not so much just the basic, like taking, I don't know, a day a week to run through your app, or like have people do that for you. Like just having real users test the app within your company. I feel like I don't see a lot of people doing that. They just sort of start to rely on all these automated tools when it's not that hard to just take 10 minutes to just test. I know it feels sort of like monotonous, but it's the like truest way to test your app.
When we created like some big features at W, I remember we would have like a meeting where everyone would test it. But I was going to say that like I feel like since I've been at smaller orgs, we're more likely to do those kinds of things like group testing, or true dog fooding using an app, and then realizing like here are all the clear pain points for our users. Whereas when you're at a larger organization, I think it's common to see automated testing solutions become the status quo. I also don't. I feel like we didn't really dig too deeply into unit testing. It sounds like I know we all used to do a lot of it. It sounds like most of us think that integration tests provide more value for like the end result, which I would agree with. But I've almost also become. I'm going to use a very specific example. We used to like kind of test components in the component library, which I talked about a little earlier. And we would be like, oh, it has this prop or it has this ability, it has that ability. And I've almost become more like anything should be able to accept everything. And if it doesn't, you should figure out how to make it do what you want, which is like a 180 to maybe thinking 6 or 7 years ago in React, where it was like, you should be very specific about what this thing does. The other layer here is probably if you're on a team that like just works on these smaller, more micro problems, you probably should be intentional and tell users what it is that you provide and what you don't. And I could see the pushback of a user maybe not wanting to inject a solution. And I'm thinking very specifically of like early on in the design system, we didn't think about how we would use an HTML input element, for example. And there are all these properties on an HTML input spec that are possible, but I believe we just spread it rest props at the time. And while today that's probably the approach almost most design systems would take, especially like Shad CN, it's just like it's your problem, deal with it. I've become like into that philosophy where it's just like, okay, yeah, it's my problem, I'll deal with it, because I've been working at a smaller scale and just setting those boundaries and limitations myself. But it is this like corporate versus maybe smaller project problem that comes up. But unit tests used to kind of capture those things for us. Whereas there are still a lot of valuable things you can unit test, especially when you do some intricate things. But I guess this overarching concept for me is like, how does it affect the end user get what they need? That's the way I like to look at testing, the same way I like to look at working on in the problem space I'm working on, but not to just build frivolous tests that may go away. And unit tests tend to, unfortunately, cause you to bloat and do like a lot of tests that are mainly like mindless, which can have value, but at the cost of moving faster. And it makes a lot more sense for a team that might own a smaller ownership area to start to invest in.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking exactly along the lines of your last point there, Scott. Like, I think that the way I look at least, it's like, it's kind of like a scale of like, what's your, what's your scope of deliverable as a team or as an engineer, right? Like, if you're on a platform team or like a, design system team, it's like, you don't really have much sway or, much, sort of, what is the word I'm looking for? Influence over the end user product that much. But the deliverable you have is like very scoped and refined, right? It's like for a design system, it's like a suite of components, and those components are generally, usually speaking, are like very specific to a use case, right? So like buttons, selects, inputs, right? And so like you're testing at that point, it's like, end-to-end testing or integration testing doesn't really make that much sense, right? Because your scope is very refined. And so unit testing is like probably the best option that you could think of. But then as you get to be like, sort of shifting down the scale or shifting to the other side, whatever, however you want to visualize it, it's like on a feature team, like your scope is a lot larger. It's like a whole suite of features, could be multiple pages. At that point, like writing unit tests for all of that is like probably pretty daunting. And an end-to-end test or an integration test might be more suited for covering that large swath of, user experience, basically. Yeah. I don't know if you guys had like sort of further thoughts on that. Some other thoughts that came into mind as we were talking is like how do we approach writing tests? It's like we talked. I think someone brought up test-driven development as like a thing of like whether they find value in it or not. Be curious, like, have you guys found value in writing tests first? Which is like in my mind is kind of test-driven development, right? Like you write a failing test, you write some code to make it work, and then it's like the red green factor or something like that kind of approach. Or do you like write tests after you write the feature, or do you kind of like try to write tests as you're writing the feature, if that makes sense? I don't know if that's like an interesting distinction. And then, maybe after we talk about that, potentially it's like what kind of tools and libraries do you guys usually reach for? Dillon, you kind of talked a little bit about the Datadog synthetic workflow as like a tool that you've been using, but curious like what else you guys might reach for.
I tend to like wait until I feel like what I've built in the code is like pretty stable. I don't want to like write a bunch of tests and then get a bunch of feedback. I think I said this in a previous episode. So write a bunch of code, get a bunch of feedback, and then have to like rewrite all of my tests. I tend to see I see that the unit tests are usually like twice the length of the code I've written in most cases. That doesn't mean it took me like twice as long to write it, especially in today's world where most of the time you probably don't write your tests. You just like tell ChatGPT, this is how I write tests. Here's my code, write some tests for it, and then you just review it and fix it. And I found that to be like pretty good for the most part. But yeah, I would say like I actually spend the most time writing unit tests and not messing with Playwright that much, just because we found that it's just like super flaky with our setup, and maybe we don't have to get into that today, but just like how you mock out backend APIs can be really, really difficult. And then I was mentioning synthetic tests as like sort of a preferred method, even though I'm not using it that much. But when things are like mission critical and I really want to make sure they're working, and also be paged, like in PagerDuty when things do go wrong, so I can jump on that and fix it, I found that to be the most useful.
Yeah, I had a few thoughts, but I think the main point, I'm going to start with the age-old "it depends," and I feel like we've either had this conversation here or I've just had this conversation with Matt in passing. I'm just going to liken it to like input versus output. Most often, I don't write my tests first in a TDD way. But if I know the output or the output already exists, a very specific example where Matt helped me with migrating over the old Wayfair navigation, or sorry, a login, and we were like worried it was going to break. That's an example where we knew the output we needed, so we could write the tests along the way to get to that output. So the way I like to shape it and explain it is, do I already know the expected output? Or in me creating this new thing, do I know what my output might be? If I do, I will try to write the test. That allows me to know that I can get there at some semblance of a solution. However, more often than not, I'm in a situation in the past year where it's like I'm creating this whole net new thing, and I'm trying to figure out how I get there. So I'll find myself writing the test towards the end. But that's usually my delimiter or my check to see is do I know like what I'm trying to achieve here? Like, do I know what it looks like, done looks like? And if I do, I can get there. So that's my advice.
That just made me think of something. And it's has to do with like not necessarily writing tests, but just like validating sort of what Scott was saying is like making sure things work the way you expect. But like doing a proof of concept of an idea outside the scope of your app completely to just validate end to end that like what you're thinking will work. That's something I've been doing at work, where I just want to like isolate the thing that I'm trying to build outside of the system, because the system is so complex. I don't want to like be distracted by the things in the system, and just get all of that working as sort of like a test, but it's not like something that's going to run automated in the future. But I'm testing that everything's going to work. So when I do move it into the app, it should work when I integrate it into the app at that point.
So now you're talking proof of concepts, and I think that's an excellent point. I've been doing this more and more, and I realized this would have been an effective skill at W as well. Matt would do this. He would POC things, and I would look at them. Like when we first tested Next.js, right? Matt created a POC repo and started setting up some of the services. But like sometimes when you're working on such a complex system, that just trying to like stay focused on what you're building can be so convoluted that it makes sense to just do it outside an isolated system. I did something like this recently. I don't know why this is so relevant. I talked in the last podcast about creating like a UI picture scroll on scroll. And I was moving things to be bucketed. TLDR, it didn't need to be done because the way we do things, we would just move everything into the bucket. So I was trying to hit the Amazon endpoint for the bucket, and I was doing it within this whole complex setup where I had like tons of images, and I was like, I'm just gonna make this fetch one. And once it fetches one, I know how I can get it to fetch all of them. So like I was going down that path of just like what am I trying to do? Like this minor core problem I'm hitting instead of like, here's all this code in which it needs to live. So that is a good strategy to try to isolate and look into the problem you're trying to solve and just validate the solution is the right path and how you fit that into the system. I guess it's like a form of testing. I think we brought up a lot of interesting like monitors or a form of testing. Manually checking your app is a form of testing. Like that was like the first thing I started with. As much as it sounds cliche, maybe just going into your application and making sure your code runs the way you want it to or you expect it to and try to like beat on it a little bit is always going to be some of the best form of testing you can do, as well as doing that as a group and seeing how other users use it. You're never going to know offhand exactly all the cases that your user are going to use. You have a inherent bias towards how you perceive it. I think that was a little bit of a non sequitur, but Matt, go ahead.
No, I think it's it's like a really good concept for us to dig on. I think there's like a few things there to pull apart. But one thought that came to mind while you guys were talking was like often I think you guys kind of touched upon this also. It's like often I look at if I attempt to sort of approach a problem with like kind of like a TDD mindset, like test driven development sort of mindset, I find that like the tests end up sort of pushing me into the corner of like how the implementation should work. And it feels like maybe a little bit of a it's like sort of limits the approach that I take with the actual code, right? It's sort of like it enforces how you write the code, or maybe it's like very prescriptive. Prescriptive. That's what I was looking for. Scott, I think you were kind of basically hammering on this in terms of like your perspective on if you know what you're trying to build ahead of time versus not, right? Like and you touched upon this also in like that example from Wayfair where it's like if we're refactoring something or like if you're going through the process of a refactor, usually what you're kind of ending up to achieve, and so it's like easier to start with writing tests, which is exactly what we did in that case, right? Like we said, we're actually going to pause the migration work. We're going to spend time writing those tests. That way we know the migration will be successful when we complete it, as opposed to writing the tests like after or during. It's like splitting it up into 2 steps made it a lot easier for us to be sure that we're making the right changes. So yeah, I think I think what you guys were saying is kind of like rings a lot of bells to me in terms of like makes a lot of sense. We haven't we've sort of like called out a few different tools that we've reached for in the past or that we use for writing tests. Curious if there's any that we haven't covered. I think we've thrown out like Playwright as something that maybe sometimes works, sometimes doesn't work for a use case. Some of these test adjacent tools like we were talking about, Datadog synthetics and monitoring metrics, things like that. Is there anything that like you guys are interested in sharing or bringing up that's like that you found to be really useful when writing tests or working with a test suite or what like anything like that?
Question. So we talked about React testing library. We didn't really talk about enzyme, but that's probably good. We talked about mocking.
Well, we didn't really talk too much about React testing library, but I think it is like, I think for front end developers, it's probably a standard at this point in the same way that enzyme was probably a standard 7 years ago or whatever, however long ago. Right. Like, yeah. So I think, it's like, I, for one, am glad that React testing library took off and was like widely adopted. I think it really helped build a better perception around how tests should be authored and how they should work.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things we maybe missed on. Like we haven't talked much about like having tests that check the accessibility of your app. That could be like one thing that's super important. I think just having like I think Axe is the name of it, run on most of your code in some way. I know there's like easy ways. I probably shouldn't say easy. There are ways to have it run on your app when it renders and just like check and make sure things are accessible and meeting standards. There was one other thought I had, but I'm going to throw it over to Scott and try to remember what that was.
Well, I'm ready to rebuttal a little bit, so thanks. That's actually something I have like Well, I don't know how much time it takes to run Axe. If I remember correctly, it looks like one single unit test basically. Maybe it can be a suite, but like I would argue it's not worth even running. Like, or we run it on like a PRs build, so
even-
that we.
yeah. We're not even at the hot takes section yet.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking also. This is a hot
I have a hot take. Maybe I should have waited. But anyway, so I just think that like it should either be ran like on a singular individual build. Like we talk about I think the overarching problem is like how do we not inflate the size of a build? Like every build should not be running that. It's so unnecessary. Like we should be able to set some standards. I believe, maybe wrongly, that engineers should be able to, for the most part, pick up on it. But there should be something in the development flow, whether that's like linting or something that like clues you into you made a mistake, than to run this on every pipeline. That seems like too much.
No, yeah, I think it like, I don't necessarily want to dig into the should accessibility tests be run every time or like separately, but I think more generally speaking, something I haven't seen as much in practice is kind of splitting up your test suite and running a smaller suite of tests against changes locally versus running like the full suite in CI or something like along those lines, right? Like I think watch mode testers sort of handle that implicitly, right? Like if you're running, let's say, Jest or some similar tool in a watch mode, then it's like it's only going to rerun tests that are changed based on the files that you've touched. But I feel like that generally our tooling isn't as good as it could be in terms of like I might have touched some code, but like I want the system to know like it should run specific tests for me that might not even be directly related, but like could be implicitly impacted by my changes. And like it should know what tests to run, and I shouldn't run the whole suite locally. Basically, is the sort of the takeaway of like if I didn't impact a specific test, I shouldn't worry about rerunning it. I don't know. This is more of like a it's like call to action of like it's like we should have better tools for our tests.
Yeah, so I did want to hit on this at some point. I know I like alluded to it slightly, but running different tests in different places is definitely a practice that we could have probably been better at W, but definitely valid. But this is just an example of like what seems like a crutch or a failsafe that's a replacement for understanding better coding standards. It should just never be acceptable that someone's not writing accessible code. Maybe I'm a little too bullish on that, since sometimes people just don't know. It's unfortunate that like semantics were taught later than like traditional HTML, but it can run on something. I'm not saying like abolish all accessibility tests, but it just seems like something that's more of a crutch, right? Like, oh, this test is failing because I guess I'm writing this thing wrong, and now that test is taking time. I feel like there's a better way to do that locally to tell you, hey, you're actually not writing accessible code, than to find out after you push your code to be deployed or to a review.
Oh yeah, I think it's a little bit like a like trust but verify sort of perspective, right? Like you want developers to always ensure that they're writing accessible features, but you also want to verify that that's happening. And I think the way I look at it is like kind of similar. I think Dillon had noticed before, where it's like you basically want to test your like core flows, your core features for a customer. And in many ways, like accessibility should be seen as like a core. I don't know. From my perspective, like accessibility should be seen as like a core part of your user experience. And so from that lens, like I would lean towards always write tests. Maybe we're going down a little bit of a rabbit hole here, though.
I was just gonna add that as soon as we start talking about accessibility, we're like gonna be going into a new episode because there's like so much to say about it.
That's true. Yeah.
I think it's like I personally, I'll like keep it at 30 seconds and then we can move on maybe. But like personally, I feel like companies just deprioritize it, and it's way more important than most people give it credit. And so it's always left at the wayside. It's only like addressed when it's a legal issue, from what I've seen. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I just want to like kind of reiterate what Dylan's saying. I agree with that. And it's more of, instead of like teaching better principles, or like, again, it can run in some sort of suite. It just like, that should not slow down a slow build that's trying to deploy. That's more of my hot take or take. But I don't love, like, I care about accessibility. I just don't love that the way we solve it is we're going to run one test that just like hopefully covers everything. And we're moving on. We're not going to teach the topic. That's not the way to address a real problem. That's going to create more problems.
Yeah, I think I like completely agree with you. Where it's like, yeah, there's always trade-offs when writing a test. Whether it's like adding a new test is almost always going to slow down your test suite. You know, whether like an individual test could only be a few milliseconds or less, but like depending on the size and scale of your test. But it's always like maybe a conscious decision that a developer needs to consider when actually writing the test of like, is this going to deliver value for us down the road? Like, and does that value outweigh the, let's say it's 4 millisecond cost every time the test suite runs, right? Like that adds up over time. But maybe the value it's providing in terms of coverage of a really gnarly bug for the UI is like completely making it worthwhile, right? Like you're trading off the slower test suite run for higher confidence that your changes don't break stuff.
All right, I got one more thing that maybe we haven't covered in testing. We've talked about like React testing library and Jest, and we've talked about end-to-end tests, but there's sort of like an in-between that maybe isn't as popular. Maybe none of us have used it. It's like, I would call it component tests. Maybe that's still a playwright thing, but it's like, instead of rendering your entire page, you just render a specific set of components and test those in isolation in a browser. I'm just curious, like, have you guys tried that? Have you found any value in it? I've always been curious about trying it. I feel like I could find value in it, and I just, every project I've worked on just never has it set up for whatever reason. And I don't know if it's because people don't know about it, because it's a newer thing, or maybe it's not that valuable.
Yeah, I have some thoughts, I guess. I could see some value. Like we kind of use unit tests usually to cover a lot of these cases, but I can see some valuable solutions that like you want to make sure your component does certain things in isolation. I'm gonna basically argue with myself. Like it might be nice to see like it does this thing in an isolated environment. However, I tend to believe, so this feature is experimental. I don't really know why, but I tend to believe putting the component where you expect it to be used and then finding any problems has a little more value than just doing it in isolation. There's probably value in testing it in isolation, but this kind of brings me back to that your ownership area is small enough where you work on this component, or this component is just so important to the fundamental ability to make money or to make sure users are having a good experience. This might deem itself worthy of being its own test, but we also just want to make sure, does this thing work where we expect it to work? I think it's very important, and man, I'm going down this rabbit hole here, but it's very important to be able to build your component in isolation and understand how it works in multiple spaces. This is what we did with replatforming. Teams did not understand. They're like, my component originally would only work in the app, and the app is the problem. And it's no, you need to know how your component works and how you put APIs into it and how it works with those APIs. So you have a better understanding of why it works in certain situations. Very important thing to do, but this reminds me of teams wanting to test in Storybook a little bit, where it's like, here's an isolated component and here's a bunch of tests we ran on it. But that's not like a real world scenario. And like one of the big points of integration testing to me is like it works in the real world and we're about to push this thing out and it's working as we expected in the expectation we expected. And it's very important. So while I don't want to diminish any value there might be, like there could be some value and there could be some tests that are integration like that you can't do in React testing library easily, or unit testing, so that you really are fundamental to how this thing flows. It may be very important to the actual product, there could be value, but I don't want it to be a replacement for this thing works where it needs to work for the user.
I think I threw my hand up before you, Dylan. Sorry. No, but my maybe hot take is that um, the way at least I see component testing is basically a replacement for JS DOM or Happy DOM, right? Like we essentially leaned into unit testing because it was a lot faster to test isolated components. But with that adoption across the industry, we basically leveraged a really hacky library to simulate how the browser works. And that simulation is often less than ideal. And it doesn't work the same way that browsers work. And so from my perspective, like that's the true benefit of component testing is like you get the unit like testing flow for, you're testing just a unit, a component. But you're testing it in a more realistic environment than how you were testing it before. Like you can still leverage RTL within component testing, as my understanding, but it's like you're like actually running a test in a real browser, so you have like a more realistic experience, which I think Scott you were kind of like noting, but it's like still separate from how is that component actually used in production, and like the consumers of my component, like how are they leveraging it in their features, and that stuff is still like maybe not covered by those kinds of tests. All right, Dylan, I know you have a lot of takes there.
All right, before we kick it back to Scott, because I know he's got 10 more thoughts.
No, I don't.
Okay. I just wanted to say that we're talking a lot about the different ways to test. And I feel like we're not meaning to do this, but it can kind of feel like we're comparing what's better than the other form. But I think like holistically, if you test in all these different ways and something goes wrong with your app, it's going to go wrong in one of these like one of these hierarchies of testing. And that's going to tell you a lot about like what's actually going wrong. Like where does the problem actually lie? Does it lie in the like unit test? Okay, that there's something wrong with the code. Does it lie in the end-to-end test? Okay, there's something wrong with the integration. Does it lie in the synthetic test? Okay, there's probably something wrong with like the actual network. So like having tests in place all over the stack of the system can be like super helpful. I know it can sound like a lot, like, oh man, I got to rate tests in 8 different places, but once you sort of set yourself up that way, I think it can like have a lot of value in the long run.
I don't disagree. I hate to like it depends, but it's all situational. It's very much based on like what you're building, what it is. Like the way I would see a component test is like maybe you give it a test API, but in theory, like something should like you're probably giving it a mock, right? And if you're just mocking it, like it would be a little more important that you give it the real API in a integrated fashion. So like a lot of the use cases could be better with integration testing. However, I am still saying there are definitely got to be use cases that this feature has to do a certain thing. And I really want to just harp on Matt really nailed it. It's like you're actually getting a true browser experience, and that will give you better than some sort of simulation. There's got to be an example that I'm missing here of like, I don't know, maybe it's the way it scrolls down the page and shows up X many pixels that you just can't simulate without a browser, and you really need it to function a certain way because that's what makes you money. I do agree that there's going to be a situation where this would be very useful, but it's more so everything's a situation of using the right tool for the right scenario, and that changes based on the size of and scale of the organization you're in and the scope and ownership of the team itself. So yes, we should use tools. Yes, we might need to use 8 tools, but depending on those variables, we might not need to use more than 1 or 2 tools. So we have to be mindful of these whole things as a whole and how long these take to deploy. And if the teams are mad that it takes an hour to deploy, we might need to consider, do we need all these tests? Are they adding value? So just trying to be mindful of these things up front before we just add things. And maybe reevaluating often. do we need X? Do we need Y? And having a little bit of ownership and autonomy to do that.
Yeah, I think well, two things. One, I think we can basically summarize what Scott just said as it depends. Um,
It depends.
but something you were saying reminded me of a really old blog post I had written. But the general gist was like code and tests should have like a half-life, and a half-life in the sense of like, you know, in the sense of like the value that it provides like maybe trails off over time. Sometimes there's tests that you basically always want, right? Like a very basic like smoke test of like, is my website up and running, right? Like that's like simple enough that you basically always want that. But it's like it's also simple enough from the lens of like it doesn't provide you too much value besides the general like, you know, like all your other tests are probably going to capture that same issue. But then there's tests that get added that like cover a really niche edge case of something, and then maybe 3 or 4 years later it's like that edge case maybe has been completely obviated by other patterns that teams have adopted or leveraged, right? It's like, okay, if you use these two tools in this really weird fashion, it led to this bug, and so we've patched it and fixed it. Um, and and like let's say, you know, 3 or 4 years later, like the pattern's completely changed where you don't even use those two tools in conjunction anymore, and so now it's like basically impossible for you to reach that edge case. But the code still lives in the code base, the test still lives in the test, like the code base for it. And so I think there's just like an interesting, you know, like I think as developers, like we're very maybe like you know, wary of deleting tests, but sometimes that could be useful to like remove tests, to remove, you know, like keep like speed up your test suite, or to just like remove things that don't matter to be tested, right? Like it's like, okay, we've been running this test and it like always passes for the past, you know, I don't know, let's say 10 years, right? Is it still worth running that test? Like, is it still providing value for us? I think that's something, a question, like that's a question that usually we don't ask ourselves that much when writing tests, but something to consider.
So our next segment, spicy takes with spicy Dillon Curry. Dillon, take it away. Do you have any spicy takes to start us off? Wait, hold on. I should probably mention we have our hot-o-meter. It's the Taco Bell sauces. Mild. Is it mild, medium, hot? Fire? Verde? Mild?
I think it's mild, hot, fire, Diablo, apparently.
Mild, hot, fire, Diablo. Spicy takes, Dylan. You got any?
I tried to come up with one that was testing related. I don't know if everybody else did that. I don't think that is a requirement, but
I did it.
all right, cool. Yeah, my hot take today was forcing people to meet like a test coverage percentage in PRs is just absolutely useless. And it basically gets people to write a bunch of tests that don't matter. They don't really think about what they're writing. They just want to make the number get met and pass the pipeline.
Wow, it sounds like my take.
Okay. Oh no.
All right. But let's rate that take. Right. Like let's provide a rating. Scott, what's your rating of that take?
My rating of the take is I agree.
That's not on the
So
scale.
therefore it's just, I guess it's just, well, mild is too low. It's let's just say it's hot. It's hot. Okay. I feel like mild is like too low. It's too low. Yeah. What's your rating of the take?
I think I can agree with hot. I think it's maybe mild to developers, but maybe closer to fire for managers and leadership. So if we balance those two out, I think it's in the hot category.
I just don't think it's the answer. I feel like it should be more of a culture thing of like, we write tests this way and this is why, and this is just part of the job. You should be doing this.
Yeah.
You know how I feel about it. It depends.
All right, Scott, what's your hot take?
All right. Well, mine sounds just like Dylan's, but regardless of the company size, visual regression testing UI is useless.
Wow. That is, I feel, okay. I'm going to give my rating of it. I think that's a Diablo take.
You think it's that hot? I thought you guys were going to give me a Verde take here. That's below mild.
I'll say like you kind of touch on it, Scott, but like the size of the company, the bigger the company gets, the more spicy this take gets, I think. At a small company, like it is useless. At a company with 10,000 engineers, which there's not many of those, but you just have to have this. There's just too many different people making changes. You don't even know who they are.
I guess my thought with it is just that, like, I'm again coming from the design system in my experience of using it, but like, you just can't catch what people are going to do with your components. Like, sure, you could use this as a barometer to be like, we didn't expect that, but like, it's still going to lead to a conversation. So, do I honestly believe that it's useless? No, there's some merit to it, but like, I don't know. I think it's overblown, is probably a good way to put it. But like, again, you write code, you put it in the ether, people are going to do things with it you don't expect.
I think broadly adopting visual regression tests isn't valuable. I think
Yes.
specific teams get value out of adopting it. And so from that lens, that's why I was rating it at Diablo. Wait, Dillon, did you give your rating of it, of the take?
I said it's a scaled rating. Depending on the size of the team, it gets spicy.
So it depends, spicy take rating.
It just keeps adding more spice.
All right.
It depends.
Yeah. All right. My spicy take was, let me pull it up so I know how to read it. Any sufficiently advanced / correct test environment is indistinguishable from production. So this is maybe not that spicy of a take, but I kind of alluded to it in the episode. Like if you build out a really advanced test suite or like a sort of a staging like environment that is meant to mimic production, you're basically going to end up rebuilding your production environment. That's the take.
So what you're really saying is that testing in prod is the best way to test.
Yes. Maybe that's a spicier take.
It's pretty spicy, but I still agree.
Yeah, I think I agree. That's a hot to spicy take for sure. I'm going to give it spicy in the spice-o-meter on the Taco Bell scale.
Taco Bell spice-o-meter.
We are not in any way affiliated with Taco Bell.
We're not yet sponsored by Taco Bell.
Yeah, I feel like taking that stance, Matt, starts to make me feel like, what am I doing all these other testing? Like why am I doing all these other types of testing?
Testing. Is it worth it?
There's the
episode title.
Wait, Dillon, what was your rating on the spice-o-meter?
Satan's breath. It's about the
Not
level of
you got
spice.
a Diablo. You got a Diablo.
All right.
Oh, Diablo, sorry.
All right, because we're crushed on time, let's do a quick 30-second what's up with you stand-up update. I don't know if we have a proper name for this for this segment yet. Dillon, what's new with you over the past week or so?
Yeah, this is a stand-up update from yesterday, what I was doing at work. How's it going, guys? I basically created an isolated, like, mirrored copy of a static built site that we have in AWS over here at Whoop, company I work at. So that was like quite an adventure of just like standing up an S3 bucket, standing up a CloudFront distribution, connecting those things, setting up policies. There's just like the AWS UI is just crazy. There's just so many different things you can set. So just learning that stuff has been really helpful to understand how that application works. I even found some things in the configuration that was set 8 years ago that's just completely wrong, which is great that I was able to find that. It's bad that it was there, but yeah, been learning a lot about that stuff in the last day or two.
Nice. Scott, what about you?
I'm really just gonna cop out here. I will be starting a new job, not next week, but the following week.
Whoa! Tell us more.
I'm starting a new job at Airbnb on March 31st.
Congratulations, Scott.
You can do air traffic.
AI platform team, front end. That's all I can talk about. It's top secret. It's an internal tool.
Are they? Is Airbnb about to start up some like on some like homes that are there's no host, it's just an AI host?
Top secret.
That's why it's top
Okay.
secret. Yeah.
I signed 5 NDAs for this one.
Dang. All right.
It's
we'll
actually going to be at your house, Dylan.
we'll have to do a special episode where like the viewer signs an NDA to listen to it.
I like that idea. Now you're cooking. Curry cooking with gas.
It should be like you also have to like subscribe to our Patreon in order to listen to the podcast. Sign
I
in
like
and
that.
subscribe to our Patreon.
Actually, Matt, we got to get on the Patreon immediately.
Yeah,
All
but
right,
yeah,
Matt,
maybe that's what I look at this weekend.
your stand-up update. What's up with you?
I've just been, I don't know, I've just been in the arena, cranking out code, doing work.
Man, this dude's vibe coding to the max.
Here's my stand-up update. Did some work, went to some meetings, and my like update for tomorrow or later this week is doing some work, going to some meetings.
All right, I got a stand-up update. I know we're tight on time here, but I actually vibe coded a whole new NeoVim setup. I'm using Folk Snacks to run it. It's like so much faster. I'm using Lazy Vim, Folk Snacks, Folk Flash. Dude, I am full in NeoVim now. It's just I am vibe coding to the max. I got Copilot cooking everything. I haven't written a line of code in 3 weeks.
I think we should do an
cursor.
I think we should. I think we should do an episode on vibe coding. It would be really curious to hear how you guys, if you guys have tried it, how are you using it? Like, what tools are you using? How have you found it?
Cool.
Maybe that's like maybe that's a challenge for this next week. Is Dillon needs to learn how to vibe code.
How do you need to learn what it is first?
I think small companies let you vibe code like crazy. And then obviously, for some reason, the one you're at, Matt, they just embrace AI or
first.
GTFO.
Exactly. Yeah, we're AI first. All right. I think that about covers it. Thanks everyone for tuning into this week's episode. Leave a like, subscribe, share it with a friend, someone you cherish. Anything
Rate
else
our
you guys got?
podcast on Apple Music and Spotify.
Apple
Give us 5
Podcasts
stars.
and Spotify.
Is it Apple Podcasts? Apple Music? I don't know.
It's Apple Podcasts.
Is that what I said?
Yeah. No. Don't give us a thumbs up though. So that counts as 5 stars.
Leave a comment. Bikeshedpod.com. Peace.
There we go. Peace out.
Peace.